Tonight we step into a silence that history pretends not to hear. So before I tell you today's story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications for future clips and give me some encouragement. As you settle in, I invite you to post your local location and the time you're listening from, so this quiet journey can stretch across the world together. Now, let's begin our journey tonight. The oldest battlefield is not a place of shouting men or clashing steel, it is a place of memory. And memory, you are told, is fragile. Yet the stones beneath your feet remember everything. The dust remembers boots, the wind remembers formations, and the earth itself remembers wars so vast that later generations would choose to forget them. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and if that thought makes your chest tighten, you're not alone. But tonight, you do not rush. You walk slowly, as if across frozen grass at dawn, toward another unsettling idea. What if the greatest wars in human history were not chaotic struggles at all, but carefully choreographed events, conducted by an empire whose name now drifts like smoke, Tartaria? You're not here to argue, you are here to listen. You imagine standing at the edge of an endless frontier. No border posts, no neat lines on parchment, only land stretching outward until it dissolves into ski. This is where Tartarian warfare begins, not with aggression, but with scale. The kind of scale that makes ordinary conquest seem childish. How do you defend an empire that appears to have no edge? How do you attack something that feels more like a landscape than a state? You feel the answer settle slowly. You do not fight such an empire head-on. You feel it. You're absorbed by it. Tartarian warfare, as the whispers suggest, is not centered on rage or domination. It is centered on inevitability. Armies do not charge blindly. They arrive when resistance has already weakened itself. They move like seasons rather than storms, like winter advancing not because it hates the fields, but because it must. As you walk deeper into this idea, you notice how different this feels from the wars you were taught about. No heroic speeches echo here. No named generals stride forward to be remembered. Instead, there is anonymity. There is discipline. There is an unsettling calm. You begin to sense that Tartarian warfare is not merely about weapons. It is about orientation, knowing where you are in relation to the land, the sky, and time itself. Battles are not sudden eruptions. They are conclusions reached long before the first blade is drawn. You pause and ask yourself quietly, why so many ancient maps show vast unified territories, while modern explanations insist such unity was impossible? Were they exaggerations, mistakes, or memories trimmed down to fit a newer, smaller world? You feel the night air cool as the idea settles. Perhaps Tartaria did not expand through endless bloodshed, but through a reputation so precise, so overwhelming that resistance often dissolved before contact. What kind of warfare leaves behind so few ruins, yet so many erased chapters? The ground beneath you changes. You're no longer at the frontier, but within it. Camps appear, not chaotic clusters of tents, but geometric arrangements aligned with stars and wind. Fires burn low, no shouting, no shrunken mongs. The soldiers you glimpse are quiet, focused, almost meditative. You realize with a faint unease that this army does not need to intimidate itself into bravery. You notice the absence of individual glory. No one wears excessive ornamentation, no one demands attention, and yet the collective presence feels immense. Like standing near a glacier, you do not hear it move, but you know it will reshape the land. You ask yourself another question, softer this time. What kind of culture produces warriors who do not seek to be remembered? The answer does not come quickly. It never does. You begin to understand that Tartarian warfare may have been an extension of worldview rather than policy. If the world is ordered, if energy flows in patterns, if harmony matters more than domination, then war becomes something else entirely. It becomes correction, adjustment, a grim, necessary act to restore balance. This idea is uncomfortable. You feel it pressed gently against everything you were taught about good and evil, victor and victim. But the voice guiding you does not insist, it only invites you to consider. You recall ancient structures, star forts, vast walls, cities laid out like diagrams rather than settlements. Were these defensive measures, or were they components of a larger system, designed with the expectation of conflict so advanced that it required architecture, sound, and even weather to participate? You're not yet shown the weapons, that will come later. For now, you are shown the mindset. Tartarian warfare begins long before armies meet. It begins in education, in patience, in teaching children not just how to fight, but when not to. It begins in learning to read landscapes the way others read faces. A hill is not just a hill. A valley is not just a valley. Each is a lever, a funnel, a cylinder alley. You imagine opposing forces, tribes, kingdoms, early states, marching with banners raised and hearts pounding. They believe war is a test of courage. They believe victory comes from force. And then they encounter something unfamiliar. Silence, delay, confusion, supply lines failing without visible attack, morale eroding without battle. Is this coincidence or design? You feel the lullaby rhythm slow your breathing as the questions accumulate, not sharply but gently. Why do so many ancient accounts describe enemies who simply retreated or vanished into the land? Why are there so few detailed records of Tartarian defeats, and even fewer of their victories? Perhaps victory was not celebrated. Perhaps it was expected. You sense that Tartarian warfare did not aim to destroy enemies completely. Total destruction leaves chaos, and chaos invites instability. Instead, this warfare seems to aim for absorption, redirection, or quiet removal, like pruning a tree rather than burning a forest. You picture a battlefield at dawn after such a conflict. Few bodies, minimal damage, the land intact, the defeated alive but changed. Some absorbed into the system, others migrating away, carrying stories they cannot fully explain, stories that later become myths. You realize something else now. An empire that fights this way would not need constant war. Its very existence would deter rebellion. Its reputation would do the work of legions. This may explain the long stretches of peace hinted at in fragmented records. Peace not because of kindness, but because resistance felt futile. And here, you feel the strange contradiction at the heart of Tartarian warfare. It is both merciful and ruthless, gentle in execution, unforgiving in outcome, like gravity. You let that comparison linger. Gravity does not hate you. It does not choose you. It simply acts. As the night deepens, you are reminded that history often favours noise over subtlety. Loud empires are remembered. Quiet ones are buried. What survives are the fragments that could not be fully erased. Maps too big to explain away. Buildings too advanced to comfortably date. Tactics echoed centuries later under different names. You are only at the beginning. Tonight is not about proof. It is about orientation, about allowing your mind to rest in uncertainty rather than fight it. You ask one final question before drifting deeper. If Tartarian warfare was so effective, so advanced, so unsettling, why was it forgotten? The answer does not come yet. It waits patiently, like an army just beyond the horizon. The first wars of Tartaria do not announce themselves with dates. They arrive instead as absences, gaps in chronicles, sudden shifts in settlement patterns, cultures that seem to pause, change direction, or quietly dissolve without a final scream. This alone should make you uneasy, because wars that leave no clear records are often the most controlled of all. Long before ink hardened into alphabets, before kings carved their names into stone, conflict already shaped the land you walk upon in your mind. You are taught that early war was chaotic, clubs against clubs, tribes colliding in desperate survival. Yet as you look closer, the ground tells a different story. Defensive earthworks too precise for panic. Migration routes that avoid certain regions entirely. Legends that speak not of glorious victories but of warnings. You slow your breathing and imagine a time when memory itself was the archive. In this deep past, Tartarian warfare does not look like war at all. There are no mass graves to point at proudly, no epic poems celebrating slaughter. Instead, there is alignment, timing, withdrawal. The earliest conflicts attributed to Tartaria seem less like battles and more like corrections to imbalance, as if someone were gently but firmly adjusting the direction of humanity. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and while that idea hovers at the edge of your thoughts, another one slips quietly beside it. What if early human conflict was not merely instinctive violence, but something guided? What if certain groups learned very early on how to steer outcomes without leaving fingerprints? You picture nomadic populations moving across vast grasslands. They follow herds, seasons, stars. Then suddenly, without famine or plague, they turn away from certain territories. Oral traditions later call these places cursed, forbidden, or guarded by spirits. But what if the spirits were not supernatural at all? What if they were memories of encounters so overwhelming, so calmly decisive that the lesson lasted generations? Tartarian warfare in this era seems to operate through anticipation. Instead of waiting for enemies to gather strength, it dissolves threats while they are still forming. A rival group begins fortifying a valley. Supplies quietly fail, weather shifts at the worst possible moment. Internal disputes arise, leadership fractures. By the time conflict would have erupted, there is nothing left to fight. You ask yourself how such precision could exist so early. How could pre-literate societies coordinate actions across distances? The answer whispered to you is uncomfortable. Maybe writing was not the first system of knowledge. Maybe memory, ritual, sound, and geometry carried information far more efficiently than we now admit. You notice something else as you drift through this era. Tartarian warfare does not rely on overwhelming numbers. Instead, it relies on positioning. A few well-placed units, aligned with terrain and timing, can redirect entire populations. Like moving stones in a river, the flow changes everywhere downstream. This challenges everything you were taught about progress. You were told sophistication comes late. But what if some forms of sophistication came early and were later lost? You imagine a gathering at dusk, elders speaking quietly. No maps, but gestures tracing hills and rivers in the air. No order sitters shouted, only shared understanding. Warfare here is not emotional, it is procedural, almost ritualistic. Violence is minimized not out of compassion but efficiency. You feel the lullaby rhythm return as another thought surfaces. If these early Tartarian conflicts were so subtle, how would later historians even recognize them as wars? They wouldn't. They would label them migrations, cultural shifts, mysterious declines. The language of academia smooths over what the land remembers sharply. You walk now among ancient ruins that are not ruins at all, but foundations reused and reinterpreted. Stone platforms beneath newer temples, star alignments beneath later mythologies. These structures are often described as ceremonial, but you sense something else. Observation points, communication nodes, strategic anchors in a vast defensive network. Were these the battlefields of the earliest Tartarian wars? You imagine an enemy approaching such a place unaware. The terrain funnels them. The sound behaves strangely. Fear rises without clear cause. At night, stars appear unfamiliar, disorienting. The mind begins to fracture before any weapon is raised. You realize then that Tartarian warfare may have begun as a psychological art. Long before metallurgy perfected blades, the mind was the primary battlefield. Confusion, awe, inevitability, these were the earliest weapons. There are stories from many cultures of gods who fought not with swords, but with voice, light, or presence. Mountains split by command, armies frozen in place by fear. What if these stories are not mapped on metaphors, but misremembered encounters with something profoundly organized? You do not rush to believe, you simply observe. As time flows forward, these early conflicts leave behind a curious pattern. Regions that later blossom into advanced centers seem to align with Tartarian influence. Regions that resist often fall into cycles of collapse. Is this coincidence? Or the long shadow of ancient strategic decisions still shaping outcomes thousands of years later? You feel the weight of deep time press gently against your thoughts. Tartarian warfare here is slow, generational. Victories measured not in land seized, but in stability achieved. Defeat measured not in death, but in dissolution. You think about how modern warfare seeks quick result, decisive battles, clear winners, but this ancient approach seems indifferent to speed. It waits, it adapts, it outlives its enemies, and then, quietly, it vanishes. By the time writing becomes common, Tartarian warfare is already evolving. Its earliest forms fade into myth. New layers of secrecy form. The techniques grow more refined, less visible. What remains are echoes, odd similarities between distant cultures, shared symbols of authority, repeated architectural forms that appear where no connection should exist. You ask yourself another question, softer now. Why would such an advanced system choose to hide itself? Perhaps because memory is dangerous, perhaps because power that is too visible invites imitation, or perhaps because this way of war was never meant to be admired, only effective. You let that idea settle as the night deepens. The earliest Tartarian wars do not shout their presence. They whisper through the ages, leaving behind a world subtly shaped, quietly redirected, and largely unaware of how close it once came to a very different path. As your thoughts slow, you realize this is only the beginning. The weapons will come, the soldiers will emerge, the tactics will sharpen. But first, you needed to understand this truth. The oldest wars are not remembered because they were forgotten. They are not remembered because they were never meant to be seen. You do not see his face. That is the first thing you notice and the first thing that unsettles you. In every war you were taught to imagine there are heroes, named, painted, remembered, faces frozen in statues, voices quoted in textbooks. But as you move deeper into Tartarian warfare, those faces dissolve. What remains is function, movement, silence. You stand at the edge of a training ground that feels older than language. There are figures moving across it, but none step forward to be recognized. No one raises a hand to claim attention. No one seeks applause. These are soldiers without biographies, warriors shaped not by ambition but by alignment. You are reminded gently that anonymity can be a weapon. The Tartarian soldier, as the fragments suggest, is not trained to express individuality on the battlefield. Individuality introduces unpredictability. Ego invites error. Instead, you sense a discipline so complete that personal identity recedes, replaced by role and rhythm. Each warrior becomes a note in a larger composition. You watch them move, not hurried, not supple stiff. Their steps seem to follow patterns you cannot quite name. Spirals, arcs, pauses timed with breath rather than command. There is no shouted cadence, no barked orders. Communication happens through glances, shifts of weight, the angle of a shoulder. You feel your own breathing slow as you observe. This is not the energy of aggression, it is the energy of preparedness. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and again that unsettling thought drifts near. If humanity were shaped, guided, constrained, would it not require guardians as much as rulers? And what would such guardians look like after generations of refinement? You imagine that the Tartarian soldier was not recruited in the way modern armies recruit. There is no dramatic enlistment, no break between civilian and warrior. Training begins early, not as indoctrination, but as orientation. Children learn balance before strength, listening before speaking, observation before reaction. Conflict, they are taught, is not an interruption of life, it is one of its cycles. You notice something else now. These soldiers do not train endlessly in violence, they train in restraint. Weapons are handled with familiarity, not obsession. Blades are cleaned slowly, respectfully, as if they are tools rather than extensions of anger. You wonder how such restraint survives the chaos of battle. The answer comes quietly. Battle itself has been redesigned. Tartarian warfare does not place the soldier into frenzy. It removes frenzy from the equation entirely. By the time contact occurs, the outcome is already tilted. The soldier's role is not to decide, but to execute what has already been set in motion. This is why names are unnecessary. You imagine a Tartarian unit advancing. No war cries, no banners waving wildly. Their presence alone changes the air. Opponents feel it before they see it. A pressure, a certainty, something ancient and unyielding, like standing before a tide that does not announce itself. You begin to understand that fear here is not provoked. It is induced by contrast. The calm of these soldiers reflects the chaos of their enemies back at them, magnified. How do you fight someone who is not emotionally present? You recall myths of faceless warriors, of armies described as shadows, of enemies who moved like one body. These stories appear across continents, separated by oceans and centuries. Scholars call this coincidence, or archetype. But you sit with the possibility that these are memories, fractured, retold, stripped of context. The Tartarian soldier, you sense, was trained to disappear in plain sight. Uniforms were simple, colours blended with terrain. Symbols were minimal, often geometric rather than heraldic, no crests proclaiming loyalty to a single ruler. Allegiance was to structure itself. You pause on that thought, loyalty to structure, not person. This changes everything. An army built around individuals can be decapitated. Kill the leader, the system collapses, but an army built around principles, patterns, and shared understanding has no single point of failure. Remove one piece and the rest adjust. You imagine opposing forces celebrating after a supposed victory, having slain a commander, only to realize nothing has changed. The formations continue, the pressure remains, the war does not end. The Tartarian soldier is replaceable by design. This is not cruelty, it is efficiency. You notice that these warriors do not appear hardened in the way later soldiers are described. There is no constant edge of trauma etched into their movements, perhaps because they are not thrown into senseless slaughter, perhaps because they are not told they fight for glory or survival, but for balance. War in this system is not personal. You feel a strange mix of comfort and unease at this idea. Comfort, because chaos is reduced. Unease, because it removes familiar moral anchors. If no one hates you, if no one even notices you specifically, what does defeat mean? You imagine a captured Tartarian soldier. What would interrogation reveal? Likely very little, not because of secrecy, but because there is little to confess. No grand plans stored in one mind, no map memorized in detail. Each soldier carries only what is needed for their immediate role. Knowledge is distributed, not centralized. This explains why so few first-hand accounts exist, why no traitor's testimony ever fully exposes the system. You cannot betray what you do not own. As the night deepens, you realize how modern this feels, and how ancient. Decentralized command, mission-based execution, psychological dominance, these concepts are celebrated as innovations today. And yet here they are, embedded in stories long dismissed as myth. You ask yourself gently whether history forgot Tartarian soldiers, or whether they were designed to be forgotten. Perhaps remembrance was never the goal. Perhaps the highest honor was invisibility. To serve, to act, to dissolve back into the population once the imbalance was corrected. No medals, no pensions, no monuments, just silence. You feel the lullaby rhythm soften your thoughts. The faceless soldier fades from view, not dramatically but naturally, like mist lifting as the sun rises. And you understand that this too is part of the tactic. An enemy cannot hunt what does not linger. As you drift onward, one last question settles into your mind. If such soldiers once walked the world, trained to erase themselves from history, how many echoes of them still move unnoticed among us? The answer does not wake you, it simply waits. The weapons come into view slowly, as if they do not wish to be stared at for too long. You expect brutality, spikes, jagged edges, instruments designed to terrify. Instead, what you see unsettles you in a quieter way. The blades are clean, balanced, almost understated. They do not scream for attention, they seem patient. You realize then that Tartarian weapons were never meant to intimidate through appearance. They were meant to endure. You step closer, and the metal catches light in a way that feels wrong, or at least unfamiliar. Not bright like polished steel, not dull like iron left to age, somewhere in between. The surface seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, as if remembering every sun it has ever known. Legends describe Tartarian alloys that resisted corrosion, that flexed without breaking, that hummed faintly when struck or drawn from their sheath. Scholars dismiss these descriptions as poetic exaggeration, but you notice how often such exaggerations repeat, across regions that supposedly never shared technology. Coincidence begins to feel like a weak explanation. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and again the thought drifts nearby, not demanding belief, only attention. If ancient civilizations possessed knowledge we no longer recognize, knowledge of resonance of material behavior beyond hardness and sharpness, would their weapons not reflect that? You imagine a forge, not roaring with chaos, but quiet, controlled heat, precise timing, metals combined not just for strength, but for response. Perhaps Tartarian smiths understood that a weapon is not inert. It interacts, it vibrates, it carries intention. This is why these weapons feel alive in the stories. Blades are said to sing softly when swung, not loudly enough to alert an enemy, but enough for the wielder to feel alignment. Armor is described as layered, not heavy, distributing force rather than resisting it outright. Impacts are redirected, absorbed, diffused. You think of modern materials science, composites, metamaterials, smart alloys, and feel a small shiver. These are presented to you as cutting-edge discoveries, and yet the old stories whisper that such ideas were once commonplace. You examine a Tartarian spearhead in your mind. Its shape is elegant, almost mathematical. No unnecessary ornamentation. Every curve serves a purpose. Penetration without tearing. Efficiency without cruelty. These are not weapons of rage. You notice how often Tartarian armaments are described as standardized. Not identical, but harmonized. Each piece fits within a system. A sword complements a shield. A bow complements the terrain. Nothing exists in isolation. This suggests something profound. These weapons were not personal property in the way later arms became. They were issued, maintained, returned. They belong to the system, not the soldier. You pause on that idea. Ownership changes behavior. When a weapon is yours, you personalize it. You name it. You grow attached. But when it belongs to something larger, you treat it differently. With respect, with restraint. Perhaps this is why Tartarian soldiers could lay down arms so easily after conflict. There was no identity bound to the blade. You imagine an enemy scavenging a battlefield expecting to loot trophies. Instead, they find little. Weapons recovered by Tartarian units quickly, armor removed, nothing left to study. What remains are impressions in the soil and confusion in the mind. This too is a tactic. You recall myths of weapons that could not be replicated, swords that lost their edge when copied, armor that failed when imitated. Could it be that the materials themselves required specific knowledge to function properly? Knowledge that was never written down, only practiced? If so, suppression becomes simple. Destroy the schools, disrupt the lineages, let time do the rest. You think of how many ancient techniques vanished suddenly. Roman concrete, Damascus steel, Greek fire, each surrounded by mystery, each dismissed as an unfortunate loss. But what if these were fragments of a much larger, older system of material science, one that Tartaria had refined to an extreme? You feel the night deepen as another unsettling thought arises. Weapons that endure do not need to be replaced often. Armies that reuse equipment leave fewer traces in the archaeological record. Fewer discarded blades, fewer broken shields. Absence again becomes evidence. You imagine Tartarian storage halls, cool, dry, organized. Weapons resting, not displayed. No obsession with their accumulation, only readiness. When conflict arises, the system activates. When it ends, everything returns to stillness. This rhythm feels less like war and more like maintenance. You ask yourself why later empires favoured spectacle. Gold, jewels, elaborate designs. Perhaps because spectacle compensates for inefficiency. When weapons break easily, you decorate them. When armour fails, you mythologize bravery. But when tools work exactly as intended, they require no embellishment. You feel a gentle tension in your chest as you consider this. If Tartarian weapons were truly this advanced, their disappearance would not be accidental. Such technology would threaten narratives of linear progress. It would suggest regression rather than advancement. And that idea is deeply uncomfortable. You recall museums filled with rusted swords, labelled proudly as ancient. You wonder how many superior tools were melted down, repurposed, or deliberately destroyed because they did not fit the story being told. You imagine a conqueror holding a Tartarian blade, unable to replicate it, unable to understand it, frustrated by its quiet superiority. What does such frustration lead to? Erasure, mockery, reclassification as myth. You breathe slowly as the weapons fade back into shadow. They were never meant to dominate your attention, only to serve. And in that restraint you sense the true danger. Because a civilization that treats weapons as tools rather than symbols may understand conflict more deeply than one that worships them. As you drift onward, you realize the next question waiting for you is inevitable. If Tartaria forged such enduring weapons, what kind of forces were they truly designed to face? The answer does not arrive yet. It waits, tempered and silent. You hear it before you fully see it. A low, taut creak carried on the wind, like a ship's hull under strain, or the slow bending of ice on a frozen lake. It is not the sound of panic, it is the sound of stored intention being held in check. You step closer, and the bows of Tartaria reveal themselves. They are larger than you expect, taller than many of the archers who carry them. Their curves are deep, almost exaggerated, bending back upon themselves in shapes that feel both elegant and unnerving. These are not hunting bows, they are instruments of reach. You feel a quiet awe settle in, because range changes everything. In most warfare you were taught, battle is decided by proximity. Who can close the distance? Who can endure the clash? But Tartarian archery seems designed to rewrite that rule entirely. Distance itself becomes a weapon. Space becomes contested long before enemies can respond. Legends describe arrows that flew farther than sight, that struck with a force inconsistent with their mass. Again, scholars call this exaggeration. Yet you notice how many ancient cultures describe Tartarian or northern bows with the same reverence usually reserved for siege engines. You imagine the materials: layered woods, horn, sinew, glues refined through generations of quiet experimentation. Each component chosen not only for strength, but for how it behaves under tension, humidity, cold. These bows are alive in a way simple wood can never be. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and once more the thought drifts near. If ancient knowledge included an understanding of energy, stored, released, transferred, then these bows make sense. They are not crude levers, they are carefully tuned systems. You watch an archer draw. There is no strain on the face, no shaking. The motion is smooth, almost meditative. The bow bends deeply, storing power quietly, obediently. When released, there is no dramatic snap, only a whisper, and then absence. The arrow is gone. You follow its imagined path across valleys, over rivers, into spaces an enemy believed safe, and you understand the psychological impact immediately. There is no warning, no line of sight, no sense of where danger begins. How do you fight what you cannot approach? Tartarian tactics with these bows seem to favour disruption over slaughter. Supply wagons struck from impossible distances. Officers wounded without seeing the attacker. Camps forced to relocate again and again, never settling, never resting. Fatigue becomes the true enemy. You think about how fear changes when it has no face. When arrows arrive not in volleys, but in precise moments. One here, one there. Always enough to remind, never enough to escalate into rage. This is not harassment. It is conditioning. You notice how Tartarian archers are often described as operating in small units, sometimes alone. Their camouflage is not elaborate, only sufficient. They do not need to hide forever, only long enough. You recall stories of ghost archers in forests, steppes, and mountain passes across Eurasia. Cultures separated by thousands of miles tell the same tale. Enemies who strike from nowhere and are never caught. Are these myths, or echoes? You imagine the training required. Strength alone is insufficient. These bows demand balance, timing, breath control. An archer must understand wind not as an obstacle but as a collaborator, must feel humidity in the fingers, must sense tension in the string before it becomes audible. This is intimate warfare. You pause on that phrase. Intimate yet distant. A contradiction that seems to define Tartarian tactics again and again. You consider how these bows pair with the earlier philosophy you encountered. War without frenzy, control without cruelty. The archer does not rush toward the enemy in anger. He or she waits, observes, releases only when necessary. Each arrow is a decision. You realize that such a system would leave very little physical evidence behind. Arrows recovered by the shooters, shafts designed to splinter on impact, leaving little to study. Tips standardized, unornamented. Again, absence. You think of modern long-range warfare, drones, missiles, engagements where the attacker is unseen, distant, emotionally removed. The parallels are uncomfortable, the timeline stretches thin. Could it be that Tartarian archery represents an early mastery of standoff warfare? That the principle of controlling space rather than bodies was understood far earlier than we are told? You imagine an enemy commander trying to adapt, sending scouts farther out, reinforcing camps, and still the arrows come, always just enough, always precise. Eventually morale collapses, not from losses, but from uncertainty, from the inability to ever feel safe. You feel a gentle heaviness settle over you as you recognize the brilliance and the coldness of this approach. It does not seek glory, it seeks compliance. And compliance, once achieved, requires no further violence. You let the image soften. The bows are unstrung. The archers step back into the land indistinguishable from it. No trophies collected, no songs composed, just quiet. As you drift onward, One final question rests beside you like an unanswered echo. If Tartaria could command distance so completely, what happened when enemies finally closed in? The answer lies ahead, carried on hooves and thunder. You feel the ground change before you hear anything. A subtle vibration travels upward through soil and bone, not sharp, not alarming at first, more like the distant promise of weather. Then it grows, a rolling pressure, a rhythm that does not belong to the land itself but moves across it with intention. This is how Tartarian cavalry announces itself, not with shouts, not with banners snapping wildly in the air, but with motion so coordinated that the earth responds as if to a single massive presence. You imagine standing still, eyes closed, and knowing without seeing that something vast is approaching. When you finally open your eyes, what you see does not resemble the cavalry charges you were taught to picture. There is no chaotic rush, no desperate sprint toward collision. Instead, there is flow. Lines of mounted units advancing in arcs rather than straight paths, their spacing precise, their speed controlled. They do not look fast at first, and then you realize they are. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and again the idea brushes past your thoughts like a half-remembered dream. If humanity was shaped, constrained, guided, what would enforcement look like on open land? Not walls, not constant surveillance, but movement, rapid, decisive, everywhere at once. Tartarian cavalry seems built on that principle. Mobility not as advantage, but as dominance. You notice the horses first. Or perhaps they are not quite the horses you recognize. Taller, broader, through the chest, enduring rather than explosive. Bred not for short bursts of speed, but for long, relentless travel. Their tack is minimal, no excessive ornamentation, everything reduced to necessity. You sense a relationship here that goes beyond ownership. These mounts are not tools, they are partners. The riders sit differently too, upright, relaxed, hands low, no constant pulling at reins. Commands are subtle, shifts of weight, pressure of knee, breath. Horse and rider move as a single decision-making unit. This is not cavalry as shock, this is cavalry as environment. You imagine how such units would operate across vast distances, covering ground that infantry could not hope to defend, appearing where least expected, vanishing before retaliation could form. Speed becomes not just movement, but uncertainty. You recall ancient accounts of armies that came like the wind and left no trail. Historians often attribute this to exaggeration, but you feel the logic now. A force that does not linger leaves little evidence. Camps are temporary, fires burn low, routes change constantly, the land itself struggles to remember them. You picture a Tartarian cavalry maneuver. One unit advances visibly, drawing attention. Another circles far wide, unseen. A third waits, patient, reading the terrain. There is no rush to engage, only positioning. When contact finally occurs, it is brief. Not a prolonged melee, but a sudden convergence. Precision strikes. Targets chosen carefully. Supply wagons, command elements, communication lines. Then withdrawal. Always withdrawal. This is not cowardice. It is design. You feel the calm efficiency of it settle into your thoughts. Why commit to attrition when disruption achieves more? Why hold ground when you can deny it? You realize now how terrifying this would be to face. An enemy you cannot pin down, cannot outflank, cannot exhaust. Every attempt to engage only reveals how far behind you already are. You think of later steppe empires, Scythians, Huns, Mongols, and notice the familiar patterns. Mobility, feigned retreats, encirclement. But something feels different here. Those empires are remembered because they were loud, destructive, undeniable. Tartaria feels quieter, older, more refined. Perhaps those later forces inherited fragments of a much earlier doctrine, stripped of its deeper discipline. Copies of Kewers, enough to conquer, but not enough to endure. You imagine a Tartarian cavalry unit operating not just in war, but in peace, patrolling borders that are not lines, but gradients, responding to disturbances before they become rebellions, maintaining flow rather than enforcing order. War becomes an extension of governance. You pause on that thought. If warfare is governance, then the cavalry is not an army. It is a circulatory system, carrying pressure where needed, relieving it elsewhere. This reframes everything. You realize why Tartaria could span such distances without constant bloodshed. why borders appear soft yet stable, why resistance seems to dissolve rather than erupt. Movement replaces occupation. You feel the lullaby rhythm slow you further as the thunder of hooves fades. The cavalry does not celebrate. It does not pursue endlessly. Once the imbalance is corrected, it simply moves on. The land exhales. As you drift onward, another realization settles gently beside you. An empire that masters movement does not fear walls, does not fear fortresses, because no structure can outpace a decision already in motion. And waiting ahead, just beyond the quieted ground, is another unsettling idea. If Tartarian forces could move like storms across open land, how did they fight when movement was constrained, when walls rose and cities stood in the way? The answer waits among stone and geometry. You do not see the weapon at first, you feel it. A low vibration brushes the edges of your awareness, subtle enough to dismiss, persistent enough to unmetal. It is not loud, it does not demand attention, it works beneath thought, beneath fear, slipping into the body before the mind can object. This is sound, used deliberately. In Tartarian warfare, noise is not chaos, it is precision. You imagine standing on a battlefield just before engagement. The air is still, no shouting, no clashing steel, and then it begins. Not a roar, but a tone, long, sustained, almost soothing. It comes from horns shaped unlike anything you recognize, from drums tuned not for rhythm but for resonance. You feel your chest respond before you understand why. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and once again the thought drifts near, no longer strange, only curious. If the human body is a system of frequencies, heartbeat, breath, neural rhythm, then sound is not entertainment. It is influence. Tartaria seems to have known this. These instruments are not played to inspire courage alone. They are tuned to terrain, to weather, to distance. Certain tones carry farther in cold air. Others bounce unpredictably in valleys. Some travel through the ground itself. You begin to understand why ancient accounts often describe Tartarian battlefields as confusing, disorienting, dreamlike. Soldiers report dizziness, nausea, a sense of time stretching or compressing. Commanders struggle to issue orders as voices feel swallowed by the air. No blades have crossed yet, and already the battle is tilting. You imagine a horn sounding from behind a ridge. The enemy assumes a charge is coming. They brace. Nothing happens. Minutes pass. Tension builds. Another tone emerges from a different direction. Drums answer, slow and irregular, disrupting any attempt at rhythm. The nervous system begins to fray. Tartarian soldiers, meanwhile, remain calm. They have trained within these soundscapes since childhood. Their breathing aligns with the tones. Their movements synchronize subtly. What confuses the enemy steadies them. This is not psychological warfare as threat. It is physiological warfare as environment. You recall myths of trumpets that shattered walls, of drums that summoned gods, of chants that paralyzed armies. Modern explanations reduce these to metaphor. But what if metaphor is what remains when the mechanism is forgotten? You feel a chill as you consider how effective this would be. No need to kill many, only enough. The rest will flee, convinced something supernatural is at work. Fear grows best in uncertainty. You notice that Tartarian sound weapons are rarely described visually. They are felt. Even in stories, details blur. A terrible noise, a strange hum, a ringing in the head. Language struggles to capture frequency. This makes suppression easy. You cannot confiscate what cannot be catalogued. You imagine a fortified enemy position. Thick walls, high morale. Then the sound begins at night. Low tones that resonate through stone. Sleep becomes impossible. Anxiety spreads. Arguments break out. Some swear they hear voices. Others feel pressure behind the eyes. By dawn, the walls are still standing. The defenders are not. You think about how modern militaries experiment with sonic devices, crowd control frequencies, infrasound, presented as innovations, rarely discussed openly, always classified. Again, the timeline bends. You ask yourself why Tartaria would invest in such methods. The answer returns quietly, because sound leaves no scars, no ruins, no evidence that demands explanation. When the conflict ends, the battlefield looks untouched. Only the memories remain, and memories are easy to dismiss. You begin to sense how all the elements you have encountered Faceless soldiers, durable weapons, distant archery, mobile cavalry are bound together by this philosophy. Win before the fight. End the conflict without spectacle. Leave nothing that invites study. Sound fits perfectly into this design. You imagine the final moments of such a battle. The tones fade, the instruments fall silent. Tartarian units advance calmly into space, already emptied by fear. There is no pursuit, no celebration. Silence returns, and with it, doubt. Did anything really happen? You feel the lullaby rhythm slow even further. Your thoughts drift like fog across a field at dawn. You realize that the most unsettling weapon is not the sword, nor the arrow, nor the horse, but the one that alters perception itself, because once perception is altered, resistance dissolves on its own. As you drift onward, another question rises gently within you. If Tartaria mastered sound, movement, distance, and discipline, how did they choose where to fight at all? The answer lies not in weapons, but in lines you cannot see. You begin to notice the lines only when you stop looking for them. They are not drawn on maps, they are not marked with stones or walls, and yet they are there, felt rather than seen, like currents beneath still water. Tartarian warfare, you realize, is guided by these invisible lines. Position comes before confrontation. You imagine standing on a wide plain. To an untrained eye, it is empty, flat, neutral. But to those who know how to read it, the land is speaking constantly. Wind patterns reveal approach routes. Subtle rises dictate sight lines. Soil density hints at how sound and vibration will travel. Nothing here is random. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and the idea lingers gently beside you once more. If the world itself were a structured system, layered, responsive, interconnected, then warfare would not be about force alone, it would be about alignment. Tartarian tactics appear to revolve around this principle. Battles are chosen, not stumbled into. Engagements occur where terrain amplifies Tartarian strengths and weakens the opponent without effort. You feel the quiet intelligence of it. Why fight uphill when patience brings the enemy downhill? Why charge when shadow wind and timing can do the work? You imagine Tartarian scouts moving far ahead, not to seek enemies, but to listen, to feel, to observe how animals behave in certain valleys, how fog settles at dusk, how echoes linger after a shout. All of this becomes data. The battlefield is prepared long before armies arrive. You recall ancient accounts of forces that refused to engage until conditions were right. Historians label this caution, cowardice even. But now you sense it differently. This is not fear, it is respect for systems larger than the self. Tartarian warfare does not impose itself violently on terrain, it collaborates with it. You picture two armies approaching the same region. One sees only land to cross, the other sees channels of movement, pockets of sound, zones of confusion. One marches, the other positions. When contact finally occurs, it feels inevitable rather than dramatic. You begin to understand why Tartarian conflicts often appear brief in legend. Not because they lacked complexity, but because the decisive moment was already complete before the first clash. You think of chess, but even that feels too narrow. This is closer to weather prediction. Subtle adjustments, small interventions, patient waiting. When the storm arrives, it feels natural. You imagine an opposing force choosing a campsite, believing it defensible. Tartarian tacticians would see it differently. A hollow where sound pools, a ridge that channels wind into tents, a river bend that limits retreat. No attack is needed immediately. The position defeats itself. Fatigue grows, morale erodes, small mistakes compound. And when Tartarian units finally move, they move into weakness, not resistance. You pause on another unsettling realization. This kind of warfare would be almost impossible to document accurately. Maps would look ordinary. Battle reports would sound vague. The enemy retreated. Conditions were unfavorable. Morale collapsed unexpectedly. Nothing concrete, nothing dramatic, and so history shrugs and moves on. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen as you consider how this philosophy contrasts with modern obsession over tactics and technology. Tartaria seems less concerned with innovation and more with perception, less with overpowering, more with outlasting. Position is not just geography, it is timing, it is expectation, it is psychology. You imagine Tartarian leaders waiting weeks, even months, before committing, not from indecision but confidence, knowing that once the moment arrives, resistance will already be hollow. You ask yourself softly, how many wars were lost before they were even recognized as wars? The answer feels heavier than the night air. You begin to see how all previous elements fit here. Sound weapons work best in certain terrain. Archery dominates open sightlines. Cavalry thrives where movement can spiral. Faceless soldiers operate best when chaos favors discipline. Nothing is accidental. You imagine an enemy commander pacing, frustrated. Every plan seems anticipated, every move countered before it unfolds. Supplies vanish, scouts fail to return, confidence drains away. And Tartaria waits, not because it must, but because it can. As your thoughts slow, you realize that this mastery of invisible lines, of terrain, timing and perception, explains something else. Why Tartarian cities and fortresses feel strangely integrated into their surroundings. Why they appear less like impositions and more like continuations of the land itself. War and architecture, you sense, are not separate in this worldview. And waiting ahead, beyond these unseen lines, stands the question of stone, of walls and cities and places that were designed not just to be lived in, but to fight on their own. The land holds its breath, and you move toward geometry. You feel it the moment you enter. The air changes, not colder, not warmer, simply organized. Your footsteps sound different here, as if the ground is listening. You're inside a city, but it does not feel like one. It feels like a mechanism waiting patiently. These are Tartarian cities. You were taught to think of cities as places of commerce, culture, crowding. Defensive walls, added later, almost as an afterthought. But here the opposite is true. Defense is not added. It is embedded. The city is not protected by fortifications. It is the fortification. You stand at the center and notice something unsettling. Streets radiate outward in precise angles. Buildings align with sightlines rather than convenience. Open squares are not random gathering spaces, but carefully calculated voids. Nothing here is wasted. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison. And the idea drifts beside you again, calm now, almost familiar. If humanity once lived inside systems designed for control and balance, would not its greatest cities reflect that logic? Not comfort first, but stability. Tartarian cities seem designed to participate in warfare without appearing militarized. You walk along a star-shaped perimeter. Bastions extend outward like calm geometric petals. Historians call these star forts a Renaissance invention, appearing suddenly in Europe, but you feel the deeper truth pressing gently at you. These designs are too mature to be first attempts, too optimized, too widespread. This is inheritance, not invention. You imagine an enemy approaching such a city. From a distance it looks welcoming. Low walls, wide approaches, no towering intimidation, and then they draw closer. Angles multiply, sightlines fracture, every advance exposes flanks, every retreat reveals blind spots. The city does not attack, it simply refuses to be approached. You notice how sound behaves strangely here. Voices echo in some corridors and vanish in others. Drums would reverberate unpredictably. Orders shouted from one section would arrive distorted in another. Confusion becomes architectural. You picture defenders moving calmly through hidden passages, emerging where least expected. Supply routes run beneath streets. Water flows are controlled, redirected, hidden. Siege becomes meaningless when the city does not rely on visible systems. You pause and feel a quiet awe. This is warfare turned into urban planning. Tartarian cities do not need large standing garrisons. Their design multiplies the effectiveness of those present. A few disciplined units, positioned correctly, become an overwhelming force. You think of later cities built atop older foundations. How often archaeologists find inexplicable layers, massive stoneworks beneath medieval streets, aligned in ways that no longer make sense. Official explanations say repurposed ruins, but what if those ruins were not ruins at all? Only obsolete configurations, adapted after the system that birthed them faded. You imagine these cities in times of peace. Markets open, children play, the geometry remains silent, dormant. Life flows gently through spaces designed for something far darker. War and peace share the same streets. You feel a strange comfort in this duality. No panic-driven fortification. No sudden transformation. The city does not change when war arrives. It simply activates. You realize now why Tartaria could endure without constant visible armies. The land itself was armed. Cities were nodes in a vast defensive network, each one capable of resisting far larger forces through design alone. You think of how modern militaries speak of force multipliers. Tartaria seems to have embedded these multipliers into stone, and again evidence fades easily. Cities evolve, walls are dismantled, streets are widened, angles softened. What remains are strange layouts, unexplained proportions, and historians who shrug. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen as the city grows quiet around you. No banners, no alarms, just geometry holding its breath. And you ask yourself gently now, if cities themselves were weapons, what else might Tartaria have shaped to fight on its behalf? The answer does not echo loudly. It arrives like weather. You notice it first in the air. A heaviness that does not belong to clouds alone. A dampness that settles too quickly, too completely. The horizon blurs, not because the weather has turned hostile, but because it has become cooperative. This is how the stories describe it. Tartarian armies advancing with fog at their backs, storms forming without warning, sudden cold stiffening fingers and resolve alike. Weather, it seems, was never merely endured, it was invited. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and the thought rests quietly beside you again, like a familiar companion. If the world itself were a closed system, responsive to vibration, intention, and alignment, then weather would not be random. It would be adjustable. You do not rush to believe this. You simply observe how often Tartarian campaigns coincide with environmental advantage. Rain that turns enemy roads to mud while Tartarian routes remain firm. Winds that carry sound and arrows farther in one direction than another. Fog that conceals movement perfectly, yet lifts at precisely the wrong moment for defenders. Coincidence begins to feel thin. You imagine Tartarian tacticians watching the sky with the same attention others give maps, reading pressure changes, understanding seasonal rhythms so deeply that timing alone becomes a weapon. An army that moves with weather appears supernatural to one that fights against it. You feel the subtle terror this would inspire. How do you plan when the environment itself seems to betray you? There are ancient accounts of battles halted by sudden storms, of sieges broken not by assault but by cold nights arriving weeks early. Chroniclers often attribute these events to divine intervention, gods favouring one side, curses laid upon another. But what if divinity was only the name given to mastery? You imagine Tartarian units delaying engagement deliberately, waiting for humidity to rise, for frost to settle, for heat to exhaust armoured opponents. Their own equipment, light, layered, adaptive, handles the shift easily. The enemy suffers. This is not cruelty. It is inevitability. You think of how modern warfare relies on weather forecasts, satellite data, climate modelling, presented as advanced, essential. And yet, long before satellites, someone clearly understood how to let the sky do the work. You feel the lullaby rhythm slow your thoughts as the fog thickens around you. Visibility drops. Sound behaves oddly. Distance becomes uncertain. Even direction feels unreliable. This is not chaos. It is control masquerading as nature. You consider another unsettling possibility. What if Tartarian sound weapons, architecture, and positioning were not isolated techniques, but part of a larger environmental system? Frequencies and influencing pressure, geometry guiding airflow, cities shaping microclimates. The idea feels strange but not impossible. After all, you have already accepted that Tartarian warfare favoured systems over spectacle. Weather would be the ultimate system, untouchable, unprovable, always deniable, no scars, no ruins, only stories of unfortunate conditions. You imagine an enemy retreating through mist, disoriented, supplies soaked, morale broken. They will tell future generations they were unlucky, that fate turned against them. Tartaria will leave no rebuttal. You sense how such anthems would erase themselves from history naturally. Who records a battle lost to rain? Who investigates fog? And yet the pattern remains, faint but persistent. You feel the night deepen as the weather clears just as suddenly as it arrived. Tartarian forces move forward, not rushing, not Zeus celebrating. They step into space already softened, already surrendered. As you drift onward, another realization settles gently into place. An empire that can align land, city sound, movement, and weather does not need to announce its power. It simply arrives when conditions are right. And waiting ahead is something far quieter than storms. Something carried not by air but by symbols, by colours and shapes designed to break resistance before it ever forms. You see the banners long before you understand them. They do not snap violently in the wind. They do not blaze with excess colour or heroic imagery. They hang with a strange calm, as if aware that their work is already done. At first glance, they seem almost simple: shapes, lines, muted tones, and yet something about them presses gently against your chest. Symbols, you realise, are quieter than weapons, and far more enduring. Tartarian warfare understands this deep. You move closer and notice that these banners are not meant to inspire excitement. They do not depict victories or mythic beasts locked in combat. Instead, they present geometry, circles intersecting lines, stars within stars, patterns that feel familiar even if you cannot say why. Your eyes linger longer than expected. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and again the thought glides beside you. If human perception itself can be guided, trained, shaped, then symbols are not decoration. They are instructions. Tartarian sigils appear designed to communicate on multiple levels at once. To allies, they signal order, alignment, safety. To enemies, they suggest inevitability. Not threat, but conclusion. You imagine an opposing force spotting these banners on the horizon. No challenge is issued, no ultimatum delivered. The message is subtler. You've arrived too late. Colour choice matters here. Deep blues and muted reds, whites that are not bright but soft, no glare. Nothing that demands attention. Instead, the colours seem to settle into the environment, making the banners feel less like foreign objects and more like part of the land. This blurs a critical boundary. Is the army approaching, or is the land itself asserting something? You recall how many ancient cultures believed symbols carried power of their own. Talismans, seals, sacred geometry. Modern minds dismiss this as superstition. But you feel the alternative explanation breathing quietly beneath the surface. Symbols train expectation. Expectation shapes behaviour. Behaviour decides outcomes. No magic required. You notice that Tartarian banners are often positioned carefully, not at the front of a charge, but where they can be seen from many angles at once, on ridges, at crossroads, above city gates. They are not rally points, they are statements. You imagine the effect on morale. Soldiers already exhausted by fog, sound, distance, and uncertainty now see a sign that has preceded defeat in other campaigns. Stories circulate quickly in war. When that symbol appeared, the valley emptied. When those colours rose, the siege ended without a fight. Fear grows roots. You realise then that Tartaria may have fought as much with memory as with force, each campaign reinforcing the psychological weight of its symbols, each encounter adding another layer to the legend, and legends fight on your behalf long after armies move on. You think of modern flags and insignia, how they inspire loyalty, fear, unity, how people react emotionally to cloth and colour. The mechanism is the same, only the intent differs. Tartarian symbols do not stir passion. They suppress resistance. This aligns perfectly with everything you have seen. No glory, no spectacle, only function. You imagine an enemy commander considering engagement. He studies the terrain, the weather, his supply lines. Then he sees the banners, and something inside him tightens. Not panic, recognition. The sense that the situation is already resolved, orders are delayed. Doubt spreads, momentum slips away, and Tartaria waits. You feel the lullaby rhythm soften further as the banners fade into the background, still present, still working. They do not need to move. Their power lies in association, not action. You ask yourself quietly how many such symbols survive today, stripped of meaning, rebranded, misunderstood. Decorative motifs on buildings, patterns on coins, shapes dismissed as aesthetic. What memories do they still carry? As you drift onward, another unsettling thought rises gently. If symbols could weaken armies before contact, what happened when Tartaria's enemies truly disappeared? Not defeated, not Kobhua, but simply gone? The answer waits in absence. You search for the battlefield and cannot find it. No shattered shields, no mass graves, no fields churned into mud by the weight of bodies. Instead, there is only quiet land and unanswered questions. This is where the stories begin to trouble you most. Enemies of Tartaria did not always fall. Some simply vanished. You imagine historians centuries later, standing where an army once camped, puzzled. Records mention a force of thousands. Supplies were counted, routes were known, and then nothing. No retreat documented, no decisive battle recorded, just absence. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and the idea lingers beside you, softer now, almost contemplative. If systems are designed to correct imbalance, perhaps removal is sometimes cleaner than confrontation. You do not assume violence, you simply follow the pattern. Tartarian warfare seems to favour outcomes that dissolve opposition rather than destroy it. Populations relocate, leadership fractures, armies disband themselves, soldiers return home without banners or orders, unable to fully explain why the war ended. Was this mercy, or something colder? You imagine an enemy force worn down by weeks of uncertainty, weather turning against them, supplies failing, sound disturbing their sleep, symbols undermining morale, every attempt to engage thwarted by terrain and timing. Eventually the question shifts from how do we win to why are we here at all? That question is lethal. You sense how Tartarian tacticians might exploit this moment, not with force but with options, corridors left open, routes subtly suggested. Retreat made easier than advance, the enemy leaves, and in leaving they scatter. Some return home changed, carrying unease rather than stories of heroism. Others settle elsewhere, absorbed into new cultures. Their military identity dissolves. From the outside it looks like disappearance. You consider how this would confound later record keepers. No final battle to commemorate, no clear victor to blame, only demographic shifts, cultural blending, unexplained gaps. History struggles with quiet endings. You recall ancient tales of entire peoples taken by the land, lost to the steppe, or called away by the gods. These phrases are poetic but also evasive. They name mystery without explaining it. What if the mystery was strategic? You feel a chill as you realize how effective this would be. Destroyed enemy leaves resentment, martyrs, revenge. Dissolved enemy leaves nothing to fight back with. No grudge survives without a story. You imagine Tartarian forces watching from a distance as an opposing army breaks apart, not in panic but in resignation. No pursuit, no punishment, simply observation. This is not conquest as domination. It is conquest as absorption or erasure. You think of how many cultures appear suddenly in history, fully formed as if from nowhere. How many others vanish just as abruptly? Archaeology offers theories: climate change, disease, assimilation. All plausible, none exclusive. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen as you accept that Tartarian warfare may have been too subtle for later minds to categorize. Too clean, too quiet. It did not leave scars. It left gaps, and gaps invite forgetting. You ask yourself softly whether some of those vanished enemies became Tartarian citizens instead. Integrated, reoriented, taught new ways of living and thinking. If so, Tartaria did not grow by killing, it grew by converting trajectories. You realize now why later empires, built on spectacle and force, would find this deeply threatening. You cannot boast about a victory no one saw. You cannot claim glory over an enemy who no longer identifies as such. Erasure becomes the only response. As the night grows heavier, you feel a strange calm settle in. There is something almost gentle about this approach, even as it feels unsettling. No rage, no cruelty, only outcome. And waiting ahead, just beyond the quiet fields of absence, is another layer of this system, one that keeps armies moving, fed and ready without leaving visible trails. The mystery deepens, carried not by soldiers but by supply. You follow the war not by blood but by bread. This is where most empires fail. Armies collapse not from defeat, but from hunger, exhaustion, and distance. Supply lines stretch thin, wagons break, roads clog. History remembers these failures clearly, because they leave messes behind. Tartaria leaves almost none. You imagine moving through territory recently occupied by a Tartarian force. The land looks undisturbed, fields intact, forests unstripped, No mountains of refuse, no scattered tools. It is as if the army passed through like a change in weather rather than a physical presence. This should be impossible. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and again the idea glides quietly beside you. If the world is a managed system, perhaps sustenance can be managed too, distributed, timed, replenished without waste. Tartarian logistics do not resemble later models built around long convoys and centralized depots. Instead, you sense a network: mobile, adaptive, decentralized. Food moves in small quantities, frequently, carried by many rather than hoarded by few. If one route fails, others adjust automatically. Nothing collapses. You imagine soldiers who do not rely on single supply points. Their rations are simple, durable, easy to replace. Hunting supplements movement. Foraging is guided by deep ecological knowledge passed down quietly. They take only what can be replaced. You pause on that phrase, replaceable. This mindset alone would dramatically reduce friction with local populations. No scorched earth, no famine left behind. Villages experience presence, not devastation. War without aftermath. You consider how this would undermine resistance. People do not rise up against an army that leaves their lives intact. They may resent authority, but they do not starve. This too is a tactic. You think of Tartarian camps, temporary, modular, almost invisible. Set up at dusk, gone by dawn, waste removed. Fires controlled, water sources left clean. The absence of debris becomes a strategic advantage. Enemies cannot track movement. Scouts find nothing to report. Intelligence dries up. You feel the elegance of it settle gently into your thoughts. Logistics here is not about accumulation. It is about flow. You recall modern concepts: just-in-time supply, distributed networks, redundancy. Again, the timeline bends. You imagine Tartarian logisticians not as bureaucrats but as field practitioners, reading terrain, anticipating needs days ahead, adjusting routes quietly. There are no grand supply trains to protect, no vulnerable choke points. The army becomes harder to disrupt precisely because it refuses to concentrate its lifelines. You ask yourself how such knowledge disappears. Then you remember. Systems like this rely on practice, not manuals. Break the practice and the knowledge evaporates. Burn the schools, disrupt the rhythms, force centralization. The rest takes care of itself. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen as the supply network fades from view like roots beneath soil. You realize now why Tartarian warfare feels so clean in retrospect. No starving cities, no devastated countrysides, nothing to provoke generational hatred, and yet such restraint would make later conquerors uneasy. How do you justify domination over a system that does not brutalize? How do you demonize an enemy that leaves no scars? You cannot, so you rewrite. You think of how Tartaria becomes, in later accounts, vague, mythical, unreal, a name without substance. This is what happens when evidence refuses to cooperate with narrative. As you drift onward, another realization settles beside you. An army sustained this way could operate almost indefinitely. Distance loses meaning, time becomes flexible, and waiting ahead is the quiet truth of how such endurance begins, not in adulthood, not in recruitment, but in childhood. The next path leads you there. You arrive where war does not look like war at all. There are no drills shouted across fields, no wooden swords clashing in anger, no lines of children being hardened into something brittle. Instead, you find calm spaces, open ground, quiet instruction that feels more like guidance than command. This is where Tartarian warfare truly begins, not on battlefields, but in childhood. You watch young ones move through exercises that appear playful at first glance, balancing on uneven ground, listening with eyes closed, learning to walk long distances without fatigue. Their lessons are not framed as preparation for conflict, they are framed as preparation for life, and yet everything you have seen before is already present here, or in seed form. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and the idea settles beside you once more, no longer disruptive, only reflective. If humanity were shaped intentionally, then training would not begin with obedience, but with awareness. Tartarian children are not taught to fight early. They are taught to perceive. They learn how wind changes before storms, how silence sounds different in forests than on plains, how animals behave when pressure shifts, These lessons are not mystical, they are practical. Survival-level awareness refined into something deeper. By the time weapons are introduced, the body already understands space. You sense how this contrasts with later militaries, which attempt to overwrite instinct with discipline. Tartaria seems to do the opposite. It aligns discipline with instinct until action feels natural rather than forced. This creates something rare, calm under pressure. You imagine a young Tartarian learning patience before strength, waiting before acting, observing before deciding. Impulsiveness is gently discouraged, not punished. There is no need to break the will. The will is guided. You feel the wisdom in this approach, heavy and quiet. Conflict in this worldview is not an interruption of peace. It is one of many states a person must navigate without losing balance. Fear is not denied. It is acknowledged, then softened through familiarity. You realize now why Tartarian soldiers appeared unshaken by sound weapons, by fog, by chaos. These conditions were not introduced suddenly in adulthood. They were normalized early, safely, gradually. Training without trauma. You imagine elders teaching through stories rather than commands. Tales of imbalance. Balance. Of lands that suffered because warning signs were ignored. Of times when restraint prevented disaster. There are no glorified battle stories, only lessons. You think of how many cultures train warriors by instilling hatred for an enemy. Tartaria does not seem to require enemies at all. Opposition is contextual, temporary, something to be resolved, not resented. This would make soldiers harder to manipulate, harder to radicalize, harder to turn against one another, perhaps too hard. You feel the lullaby rhythm slow further as you consider how threatening this would be to later systems built on control, an army that cannot be inflamed by propaganda, a population that does not crave heroic sacrifice. How do you rule people who are calm? You imagine Tartarian children growing into adults who see war not as identity, but as function. They step into it when needed. They step out when finished. No glorification, no addiction. This alone could explain much. You think of how later histories portray Tartaria as either savage or unreal. Extremes serve erasure well. Balanced systems are harder to dismiss honestly. As the training grounds fade from view, you feel a quiet respect settle in your chest. Not admiration, not awe, something gentler. Understanding. And with it comes a deeper question. If Tartarian warfare was taught so carefully, so patiently, how did it reconcile compassion with necessity? How did mercy coexist with ruthlessness? That paradox waits just ahead, like a calm lake hiding deep water. You feel the contradiction before you understand it. A softness wrapped around something unyielding. A calm that does not hesitate, even when the outcome is severe. Tartarian warfare lives inside this paradox, and here you are finally invited to sit with it. Mercy and ruthlessness are not opposites in this system. They are partners. You imagine a Tartarian commander standing before a defeated force. There is no triumph in the posture, no anger in the eyes. The decision has already been made, long before this moment arrived. What remains is simply execution, not of people, but of outcome. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and the idea rests beside you once more, quiet and steady. If systems are designed to maintain balance, then compassion is not sentiment, it is efficiency. And ruthlessness is not cruelty, it is finality. Tartarian rules of engagement appear to reflect this clarity. You sense that violence is never used to teach a lesson. Lessons are taught beforehand. Violence is used only when correction is unavoidable. And when it is used, it is decisive enough that it never needs repeating. This is where later minds struggle most. Because this form of mercy does not look kind. It looks indifferent. It does not negotiate endlessly. It does not offer repeated chances that drain time and lives. It ends the imbalance. You imagine an enemy population offered paths rather than ultimatums. Relocation instead of annihilation. Integration instead of humiliation. Those who accept find themselves absorbed quietly into a larger system. Their customs fade gradually, not violently. Their children grow up without the memory of resistance. Those who refuse are not punished emotionally. They are removed functionally. You feel a chill, not from fear, but from precision. There is no hatred here. Hatred complicates outcomes. It creates echoes. Tartarian warfare seems to aim for silence after conflict, not applause, not mourning, just quiet continuation. You think of how modern wars struggle to end cleanly, how victory sours into occupation, how resentment breeds cycles of revenge. Tartaria appears to have understood this deeply. End things once, end them completely, leave nothing to reignite. You pause and consider how unsettling this would feel to later moral frameworks. Where is the heroism? Where is the suffering to point to? Where is the narrative arc? There is none, only resolution. You realize now why Tartarian warfare resists classification as either brutal or benevolent. It does not operate on emotion at all. It operates on systems thinking, and systems do not feel, they function. You imagine Tartarian soldiers taught to show kindness where possible, not as weakness, but as efficiency. Kindness prevents rebellion. Stability prevents conflict. Conflict drains resources. Mercy becomes practical. But when mercy fails, hesitation disappears. You feel the lullaby rhythm slow even further as this realization settles in. This is not a story meant to comfort you. It is meant to steady you, to show you a way of thinking that does not flinch. You wonder how such a system could survive in a world that increasingly values spectacle, outrage, and identity. Perhaps it could not. Perhaps that is why it faded. Or perhaps it did not fade. Perhaps it withdrew. You sense that Tartarian warfare did not end because it was defeated. It ended because it was no longer compatible with the noise of later ages. Systems that require calm cannot thrive in chaos. As you drift onward, another quiet truth emerges. Rules like these are rarely written down. They are lived, practiced, passed through example, which means they can be erased without burning a single book. And waiting ahead is the proof of that erasure. Manuals whispered about, maps destroyed, knowledge intentionally scattered so it could never be whole again. You move toward the ashes of memory. You walk through what remains, and what strikes you most is not destruction, but selectivity. Not everything burned. Not everything was taken. Some things were left behind deliberately, half-legible, incomplete, misleading. This is the signature of suppression that understands its target well. Lost manuals, burned maps, fragmented instructions, Tartarian warfare, you sense, was never erased by accident. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and the idea lingers beside you again, faint but persistent. If knowledge itself can shape reality, then controlling knowledge becomes the highest form of power. And Tartaria seems to have understood this long before others dared to try. You imagine manuals not written as books, but as sequences, movements, rituals, spatial habits, knowledge that lives in practice rather than text. When conquerors arrive, they search for scrolls and libraries. They burn what they can find, but they do not know what to look for. So Tartaria adapts. Or perhaps it always planned for this. Maps are destroyed first. Not just geographic maps, but conceptual ones. How to read terrain, how to feel timing, how to sense imbalance. Without these maps, the techniques lose coherence. They become fragments, interesting but unusable. You think of how many ancient texts survive only as quotations in hostile sources. How often techniques are described without explanation, leaving later generations baffled. They moved strangely. They fought without fear. They seemed to know the land. Descriptions without instruction. You imagine a later scholar trying to reconstruct Tartarian warfare from these scraps. They would fail not because the system was simple, but because it was too integrated. Remove one element, and the rest lose meaning. Sound without terrain is noise. Movement without timing is chaos. Weapons without restraint are brutality. The system collapses unless held whole. You feel the quiet sadness of this realization. Not tragedy, not outrage. Something softer. Acceptance. You imagine Tartarian elders choosing what to hide and what to let fade, passing some knowledge into innocuous practices, architecture, music, agriculture, where it would survive unnoticed. Letting other parts disappear entirely, better to lose a weapon than to have it misused. You pause on that thought. How many technologies vanished not because they were weak, but because they were dangerous without context? You think of later empires discovering fragments of Tartarian knowledge and misapplying them. Star forts without understanding sound, cavalry without restraint, symbols without memory, copies that look impressive but lack coherence, power without balance. Perhaps this is why later warfare becomes louder, messier, more destructive. The quiet parts were gone. You feel the lullaby rhythm deepen as the ashes settle around you. The manuals are gone, the maps are gone, but the land still remembers, the geometry still whispers, the weather still responds. Total erasure was never possible. You realize now that Tartarian warfare did not vanish entirely. It fractured, diffused, hid inside other systems, echoed forward imperfectly. And that leads you to the unsettling realization waiting ahead. When you look at modern militaries, at doctrines, formations, strategies, you're not seeing something entirely new. You're seeing reflections, distorted, incomplete, but familiar. You step away from the ruins, carrying that thought with you, toward a future that looks suspiciously like a past half remembered. You recognize it before you want to. A formation that feels familiar, a doctrine that sounds new only because it wears modern language. When you listen carefully, beneath the acronyms and technical jargon, something older is breathing. Echoes do not announce themselves, they repeat. You watch modern militaries train, small autonomous units, decentralized command, emphasis on initiative rather than rigid orders. Mission-based execution, they call it. The words feel clinical, but the philosophy beneath them feels ancient. You feel a quiet unease settle in. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and once again the idea drifts beside you, almost tired now, as if it has been walking with you all along. If humanity cycles through forgetting and rediscovery, then warfare would not evolve in a straight line, it would spiral. You notice how modern doctrines prize speed without mass, precision over volume, psychological dominance over brute force, control of space, information and perception. These are celebrated as breakthroughs of the late 20th and 21st centuries, and yet you have already seen them. Tartarian warfare favoured faceless soldiers. Modern armies speak of interchangeable operators. Tartarian logistics were decentralised. Modern forces chase resilient supply networks. Tartarian tactics prioritise positioning. Today it is called shaping the battle space. New names, old bones. You feel the lullaby rhythm steady your thoughts as you observe how sound reappears too. Sonic crowd control devices, infrasound research, psychological operations designed to exhaust rather than annihilate. Weather manipulation discussed quietly, never confirmed, always denied. Again, deniability. You imagine a modern strategist encountering fragments of Tartarian methods centuries ago, perhaps through architecture, folklore, misdated texts. They would not see a coherent system, only ideas, concepts, tools, enough to inspire, not enough to restrain. This may explain something deeply unsettling. Modern warfare often borrows Tartarian techniques without Tartarian philosophy. The restraint is gone, the patience is gone, the quiet acceptance of limits has been replaced by urgency, competition, spectacle, power without balance. You feel the weight of this difference. Tartaria used dominance to prevent prolonged conflict. Modern systems often prolong conflict to justify dominance, the same tools, opposite intentions. You think of how modern soldiers are celebrated individually. Medals, biographies, heroic narratives. Tartarian anonymity has been inverted into personal branding. Visibility replaces invisibility. Does this strengthen armies or weaken them? You ask the question without demanding an answer. You notice how modern fortifications echo star-shaped designs, now disguised as bases, secure zones, logistics hubs. Geometry persists, but the cities around them no longer integrate defense into daily life. Separation returns. You recall Tartaria's cities that were the weapon. Now, weapons sit apart from life, guarded, isolated, feared, fragmentation again. You feel a quiet sorrow at this point in the journey. Not nostalgia, recognition. Something elegant was broken into parts, and the parts forgot how they once fit together. And yet, echoes endure. You imagine a future historian looking back at this era, noticing patterns we barely register, seeing how often old ideas re-emerge when systems strain, seeing how control always drifts back towards silence, precision, and subtlety, no matter how loud the age becomes. You breathe slowly as the realization settles. Tartarian warfare may not be gone, it may simply be incomplete wherever it appears. And incomplete systems behave unpredictably. This thought lingers with you as you move forward toward the final questions history avoids. why such a system would be forgotten on purpose, who benefits when quiet power disappears, and what happens when memory itself becomes the battlefield. Those questions wait just ahead, wrapped in deliberate forgetting. You begin to feel the pressure of forgetting itself. Not the natural fading of memory, but something more deliberate. A smoothing over, a quiet insistence that certain questions are unnecessary, inconvenient, even dangerous. This is where Tartarian warfare does not end, but transforms. Suppression is not loud. It does not arrive with soldiers or decrees. It arrives with revisions, with omissions, with footnotes that quietly redirect attention elsewhere. You sense that Tartaria did not vanish in defeat. It vanished in editing. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory. Humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and the thought now feels less like a theory and more like a lens. If reality itself can be structured, then memory, shared memory, must be carefully managed. Otherwise, people begin to notice patterns they are not meant to see. You imagine later empires inheriting Tartarian lands, cities, roads, systems they did not fully understand. At first, they use what they can. They live within the geometry. They march along the old routes. They occupy the cities that seem strangely easy to defend. But unease grows. These systems do not flatter rulers. They do not center power on individuals. They do not celebrate conquest. They function without asking permission, and that is intolerable. So the stories begin to change. Maps are redrawn. Names shift. Tartaria becomes a vague region instead of a coherent entity. Its timeline stretches and thins until it feels implausible. Too large, scholars say, too unified. As if scale itself were evidence against memory. You feel the quiet brilliance of this tactic. Do not argue, do not destroy everything, simply make belief uncomfortable. You think of how often children are taught that certain ideas are debunked, without ever learning what they were. Curiosity ends before it begins. The war is won without resistance. You imagine Tartarian warfare manuals never being burned publicly, but classified, misfiled, stripped of context. Techniques reframed as coincidence. Architecture labelled aesthetic, symbols dismissed as decoration. Nothing false, nothing complete. You sense how suppression here mirrors Tartarian strategy itself. Win before confrontation, dissolve opposition, leave no battlefield behind. History becomes the final terrain. You pause and consider how deeply this forgetting has worked. Even now, to speak of Tartaria invites mockery or dismissal. That emotional reflex did not arise accidentally. It was trained. You feel a chill, not fear but clarity. An empire that mastered perception on the battlefield would not neglect perception in memory. You notice how modern education emphasizes fragmentation, specialization, separation of disciplines, architecture divorced from warfare, music divorced from psychology, weather divorced from intention. Connections are dangerous. You feel the lullaby rhythm slow further as you realize this forgetting is not complete. It never is. Too many fragments remain. Too many echoes persist. Too many questions refuse to sleep. Star forts that make no sense for their supposed era. Maps that show impossible continuity. Myths that agree across continents. Tactics rediscovered and celebrated as new. The system was broken but not erased. And here, gently, another thought rises. Perhaps Tartaria did not resist this suppression. Perhaps it expected it. Perhaps vanishing was the final maneuver. A strategic withdrawal from a world no longer aligned with its philosophy. If so, silence was not defeat. It was choice. You carry that idea with you as the night deepens. Only 2 sections remain. The war now shifts inward, toward meaning rather than method. Because the final question is not how Tartaria fought, it is why. You stand now at the quiet edge of the question, not how Tartaria fought, not how it vanished, but why it ever fought at all. This is where the noise finally falls away. Throughout the journey you have seen that Tartarian warfare does not resemble ambition. It does not hunger for expansion, glory or domination. It reacts rather than provokes. It corrects rather than conquers. And this leaves you with an unsettling realization. Perhaps Tartaria did not see itself as an empire. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and now that idea settles fully into place, not as fact, but as metaphor. If humanity exists within a bounded system, fragile and self-destructive when left unchecked, then power takes on a different responsibility. Not to rule, but to stabilize. You feel the weight of this thought pressed gently against you. What if Tartarian warfare was never about enemies at all? What if it was about thresholds, points beyond which imbalance became dangerous? War then is not punishment, it is intervention. You imagine Tartaria as a caretaker civilization, one that understood cycles long enough to know when gentle influence failed, when persuasion no longer worked, when correction required force, not emotional, not vengeful, but precise. This reframes everything. Cities designed as defensive mechanisms were not built out of fear, but readiness. Training from childhood was not indoctrination, but calibration. Weapons were not symbols of dominance, but tools of last resort. Even disappearance begins to make sense. A system designed to preserve balance would recognize when its own presence became destabilizing, when being remembered created more harm than being forgotten. Withdrawal becomes responsibility. You sit with that idea quietly. You think of guardians in old stories, figures who step in briefly, decisively, then fade, never claiming reward, never staying long enough to be worshipped. Their absence becomes part of the protection. Perhaps Tartaria understood something modern civilizations struggle to accept. Power that lingers corrupts itself. Control that remains visible invites resistance. Stability sometimes requires letting go. You feel a strange calm at this point in the journey. The pieces align not into certainty but coherence. Nothing demands belief. Everything invites contemplation. You ask yourself gently whether humanity today is capable of such restraint, of stepping back once balance is restored, of choosing silence over legacy. The question hangs unanswered. You imagine Tartarian leaders debating not conquest, but timing, not victory but necessity, war not as triumph, but burden, something done reluctantly, carefully, and ended as soon as possible. This would explain the lack of monuments, the absence of celebration, the quiet tone that follows every encounter in the stories. You realize now why Tartarian warfare feels so unlike the wars you know. It was never meant to inspire. It was meant to conclude. As the night deepens, you sense the journey nearing its end. One final space remains to be crossed. Not a battlefield, not a city, but the silence that follows the last correction. What happens when a warlike system chooses peace so complete that it erases itself? That answer waits with you, softly in the dark. You arrive where nothing moves anymore. No armies, no banners, no distant thunder of hooves or low vibration of horns. Just quiet land beneath a wide, patient sky. This is not ruin. It is not victory. It is what comes after a system has finished its work. The last battle of Tartaria is not recorded because it was not fought against an enemy. It was fought against itself. The Sumerian tablets reveal a shocking theory: humanity may have been engineered inside a planet-sized prison, and now that thought dissolves into something gentler. If humanity exists inside cycles of rise, imbalance, correction, and forgetting, then Tartaria's final act was not conquest, but withdrawal. You feel this truth settle slowly, like dust after a long journey. An empire built on restraint would eventually recognize a danger greater than any rival force: dependence. When others stop learning balance because someone else will enforce it, when correction replaces responsibility, that is when guardians must leave. You imagine Tartarian forces standing down, not in defeat but in completion. Cities continue without them. Systems persist quietly. Knowledge fragments by design. No final declaration is made, no warning issued. Silence becomes the final tactic. You realize now why Tartaria feels like a ghost in history. Not destroyed, not conquered, simply absent. An absence shaped carefully enough to avoid collapse, yet deep enough to prevent resurrection. You stand in that absence and feel something unexpected. Relief. Because a world that no longer relies on hidden guardians must eventually learn to correct itself, or fail openly. There is honesty in that risk. You look around and see echoes everywhere. In architecture, in military doctrine, in moments when restraint almost wins, then slips away. Tartaria did not vanish completely. It left reminders, not instructions, hints, not answers. And now the story slows. The night grows softer. The questions grow less sharp. You're no longer asked to solve anything, only to rest with the idea that history may be quieter, wiser, and stranger than you were taught. That some wars were fought so well they left nothing behind. that some empires chose silence over legacy. And that meaning does not always arrive with proof, sometimes it arrives with calm. You breathe more slowly now. The images fade into darkness. Not abruptly, but like stars dimming at dawn. Tartarian soldiers step back into the land. Cities settle into stillness. The wind smooths over old paths. Memory loosens its grip. You are safe here. Nothing is demanded of you. No belief, no conclusion. Only a gentle awareness that the past may hold lessons not meant to be argued over, but felt. You let the questions rest beside you instead of inside you. They do not need answers tonight. The land is quiet. The sky is wide. And whatever once watched over the balance of the world has stepped aside, trusting you to find your own way. Your thoughts slow. Your breathing evens out. The story closes its eyes.